In a time before smartphones, social media, and binge watching, the Victorians were remarkably creative in finding ways to spend their free time. A culture obsessed with the afterlife, the Victorians would spend the day enjoying a meal next to a grave, and then the evening trying to contact a lost loved one. Fascinated by the teachings of Charles Darwin and the scientific revolution, they paid fortunes to collect rare plants and witness medical anomalies firsthand. Even expired animals could be grouped into entertaining tableaux for audiences to wonder at. With hobbies bordering on the occult, morbid, and just plain weird, it's no wonder we're still fascinated with life in the Victorian era more than a century later. In this video are some of the more unbelievable, but all very true hobbies Victorians enjoyed in their free time. Welcome to Story Time. They picnicked in cemeteries. While today we see cemeteries as quiet, somber places, the Victorians saw them as the perfect spot to enjoy a meal. The trend of picnicking in cemeteries became so popular that by the end of the 19th century, regulations were created to prohibit refreshments on the grounds. The cemetery picnic fad came about for a few reasons. First, there was a high mortality rate among women and children during the Victorian era, meaning cemeteries were a place for family members to be close to a loved one that had unexpectedly passed. There was also a lack of public parks throughout the United States, making cemeteries one of the few spaces with plenty of lawn to spread out on. In the Victorians' defense, public cemeteries were designed to look like gardens, unlike traditionally solemn church cemeteries. They anthropomorphized taxidermy. The Victorians' obsession with the afterlife often spilled over into other areas of their lives. As interest grew in the study of science and nature, Victorians became increasingly curious about taxidermy. Taxidermy had been invented only a century before the Victorian era and usually left animals looking like grotesque cadavers. At the first World's Fair in London, German taxidermist Hermann Plauke displayed his massive collection of lifelike anthropomorphized taxidermy to eager crowds. The various tableaux he created included a schoolhouse full of rabbits, singing cats, and ice skating hedgehogs. Plauke's taxidermy was one of the most visited exhibitions at the 1851 World's Fair and a favorite of Queen Victoria. It's interesting to note that English author Lewis Carroll also studied Plauke's exhibits and published Alice's Adventures in Wonderland years later in 1865. They made jewelry out of human hair. With loved ones perishing often and unexpectedly, Victorians developed different ways to keep the memory and spirit of their dearly departed alive. One of the more extreme examples of this trend was turning the hair of a deceased person into jewelry. For instance, a husband might have a lock of his wife's hair turned into a watch fob after she passed in childbirth. Women regularly wore rings, necklaces, and brooches containing the hair of a child or close relative who had passed. The Victorians even collected locks of hair for their scrapbooks. Wearing hair was normal, if not trendy, although turning hair into jewelry fell out of fashion by the mid-1920s. The Morbid Anatomy Museum in Brooklyn offered a hair-making class as recently as 2014. There is even a Victorian hair museum in Missouri that is open to the public. They attended freak shows. As more and more people learned about Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, Victorians became enthralled with physical and medical anomalies. While freak shows had existed since the 1600s, the industry grew in the mid-19th century and spawned stars with outlandish names like Jojo the Dog-Faced Boy and Alice Bounds the Bear Lady. P.T. Barnum was perhaps most successful at commercializing the freak show, crafting elaborate, oftentimes exaggerated, stories about the stars in his show. Despite the strong class distinctions of the Victorian era, people from all walks of life attended freak shows as a form of entertainment. One of the most famous freak show stars, General Tom Thumb, even performed for Queen Victoria and Abraham Lincoln. The demand for freak shows drastically declined after the Victorian era. Journalists broke countless stories about the mistreatment of freak show performers, and the public sought other forms of entertainment. They regularly visited morgues. Family outings in the 21st century typically involved trips to the movies or an amusement park, but for Victorians, the morgue was a regular source of entertainment, spurred on by newspaper accounts that graphically described unidentified cadavers. And obsessed with the great beyond, people would rush to the morgue to view them. The Paris morgue was particularly popular throughout the Victorian era and one of the city's greatest tourist attractions at the time. The building was designed to accommodate large groups of people in order to quickly identify cadavers, which resulted in hordes of people gathering to view them. When a child's remains were discovered in Paris with just a bruise on her hand, over 150,000 people came to view her after her story was sensationalized by local papers. They used flowers to send each other messages. Despite the very public way that Victorians dealt with passing on, they were extremely reserved about showing emotions. In many cases, especially in romantic endeavors, Victorians used flowers as an elaborate way to send messages of affection, disdain, and even danger. The practice grew so popular that books were published on the language of flowers, so people knew the correct flower to send depending on the occasion or message. For instance, a red rose signified romantic desire, while yellow roses were given or worn as a sign of friendship. Mix up the two and you could have an awkward situation on your hands. If a man gave a woman a red rose, she could then respond by sending back a yellow carnation to indicate she was not interested in the suitor, or straw to indicate mutual feelings. Flowers also held significant meaning outside of courtship. Rosemary was given in remembrance of a loved one, while rhododendrons were sent to warn of impending danger. They posed for mourning photos. Despite the grandeur of the Victorian era, disease and demise were a part of everyday life. Without modern medicine, a woman could easily perish in childbirth. A child could succumb to now treatable illnesses like scarlet fever and rubella. Some children passed at such a young age that they never even had their photograph taken, at least not while they were alive. Death photography was a popular practice in the Victorian era as yet another way to hold on to the memory of a loved one taken too soon. In some cases, the person would be photographed lying in bed so that they appeared to be sleeping. Some photographers went as far as to paint eyes onto the deceased's eyelids to make them appear awake. In the case of a young child's passing, the parents often took a family portrait that included the child and their living siblings. As it became cheaper and more accessible to take photographs, and as medical care improved, the art of postmortem photography was left behind. Although many such photos still exist, they communicated with spirits. Early on in the Victorian era, spiritualism became a popular movement for those dealing with the grief of departed family members. An increasing number of people claimed to be mediums who could help the living communicate directly with the departed through seances. Spiritualism was embraced by the upper class, including prominent members of society, such as Queen Victoria, Mary Todd Lincoln, and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. During seances, mediums would go into trances and even levitate while communicating with the spirits. Participants would also witness furniture moving and phantom rappings. Perhaps the most famous spiritualists of the time were the Fox sisters. When they were adolescents, Maggie and Kate Fox claimed to contact the spirit of a man who had passed in their home in upstate New York. After going to live with their older sister, Lee, the three Foxes all showed psychic abilities and began touring the country as mediums. The sisters were incredibly successful until Maggie publicly confessed that their seances were a hoax. She demonstrated to an audience how she could make phantom rappings with her toes, knuckles, and other joints. She also said that the atmosphere created during seances caused many people to experience things that did not actually exist. While Maggie later recanted her statement, it was a permanent stain on the spiritualist movement. They posed for vignettes. Victorians were limited in the types of entertainment available to them, but also eager to escape the turmoil of daily life. One rich source of entertainment was to dress in costume and pose in vignettes for friends and family. Derived from tableaux vivant or living picture, vignettes would depict famous works of art or events in history. If a family had money, they would pay to have the vignette professionally photographed. As technology advanced, vignettes could be recorded and then played back using a series of slides, music, and live narration. They were essentially the precursor to motion pictures. Vignettes gave the Victorians a place to express their creative sides, as well as embrace their love of art, history, and fairy tales. They made intricate patterns out of microscopic algae. The Victorians combined their interest in science and art through the creation of miniature artworks known as diadem arrangements that were invisible to the unaided eye. Diadems are microscopic pieces of algae that can be arranged on glass slides in an endless variety of intricate geometric patterns. Diadem art pieces had to be magnified in order to be appreciated, as they could easily fit inside the period at the end of this sentence. Due to the time and expertise needed to create these strange pieces of art, they were generally only owned by members of the upper class who had an interest in the naturalist movement. Other variations of diadem art include microscopic arrangements of butterfly and insect scales. They scrapbooked with seaweed. Wealthy Victorians loved to bring the natural world into their homes in perhaps less than natural ways. Scrapbooking was a common hobby for women who spent much of their time indoors, and some used seaweed as a focal point in the scrapbook. In some cases, seaweed was displayed on top of a decorative lace doily, but some women went as far as writing their name in seaweed on the front page of the scrapbook. There might also be a poem included next to the seaweed. Someone with a good sense of humor might even write a poem from the seaweed's perspective. They played sports like soccer and croquet. While it seems odd now, the rich greens and reds of the seaweed could be quite striking, and it became a popular trend. It has been reported that even Queen Victoria had her own seaweed scrapbook during childhood. So what do you think? Which Victorian event do you find interesting? Let us know in the comments below.